Okay, so today starting a new person, Thomas Aquinas, and I've got this famous painting in iLearn as the image for your first section on him, and he's standing there and he's holding two things in his hands. He's holding a sort of model church in one hand, I forget which is the right and the left, and then he's got a book in the other hand, and that book is actually Aristotle. So what we have with Thomas Aquinas is somebody who is continuing the theories of somebody we've been studying now for 3 weeks, Aristotle. So you're going to see some of the same issues come up again. He's a commentator, he's an interpreter of Aristotle. But like everybody who's interpreting, he's placing Aristotle in his own time. Just like when we just talked about this application assignment. If you're taking virtue ethics and you're using Plato, you're not back in ancient Greece, right? You're in 21st century America, and you have to somehow make what you studied relevant to something that could happen in 21st century America. Well, Thomas Aquinas did that in the 13th century, the High Middle Ages. And one of the things that was going on then is in the West, we'd lost a lot of Aristotelian texts. They had them in the East, and the Arabs had translated them and preserved them. And they came through Spain into Western Europe, and all these, people teaching, like Thomas Aquinas, in these, great university towns, suddenly had all this material that was, there to make sense of things. Aristotle is a great philosopher. Hopefully, through reading him, and at least maybe through thinking about some of the things, he's opened your mind to some things you haven't thought of before, or you've thought about things in ways that you haven't looked at it before, like say your friendships, right? Or whether you're responsible for your own actions in this way or that way, or where you want to go with your life. Maybe thinking about happiness reoriented something for you. Well, that same thing happened with these guys. And there was kind of a conflict going on. So this is actually going to lead us into talking about two different moral theories that we haven't talked about so far, and raising an issue that we haven't thought about so far. You remember at the beginning of the semester I had you do that list, and I said, okay, what do you guys value? What do you care about? And first thing you guys said was family, right? And I had to sort of coax out of you that some of you would actually like to have some money, which usually isn't a problem with the students. Usually that's one of the first things they say. But you guys are actually, you have fairly good moral compasses, so you named off things like having a good career, friends. Eventually, you said, yeah, pleasures, just for the sake of pleasures. And then somebody in here, I don't remember who it was, said God. You guys remember that point? It was a long time ago. And if you bring up stuff like that when we're talking about moral issues, especially in our culture, people can get very uncomfortable. So you're not supposed to talk about God in the classroom. Well, that's actually kind of a strange viewpoint, because throughout history, most of the people that we're studying had some sort of views on God. Aristotle had views on God. The Greeks believed in gods. Aristotle actually didn't believe in the same gods that the Greeks did. He believed in something much more similar to what Thomas is talking about. Plato talks about the gods. Epictetus talks about the gods. The people that we're going to read later on in the semester, some of them were atheists, some of them were agnostics, some of them were committed Christians. Let me think. Well, committed Christians of some sort of sort, at least. Thomas Hobbes was a Christian, but he had some really weird views. So he was in what you could call a church of one. Thomas Aquinas is right in the center of all these sort of controversies. And one of the big issues that you have to think about when it comes to talking about religion and ethics is, can they be brought together? Or if you bring up religion, are you automatically sort of closing the door to anybody who doesn't share your beliefs? Even if you're an atheist, that could be an issue. If you are a hardcore committed atheist and you have a ethics that has no room for God in it, maybe other people can't share your views. So there's two types of moral theory that we're going to talk about that grapple with these issues. But let's lay out what's the conflict. So it's framed like this in the Middle Ages: Aristotle and the Church. And if you know anything about Galileo and the Galileo controversy, by the time that takes place, Aristotle is somebody who's actually being very accepted in the Church. And, Galileo went against Aristotelianism. There's a lot more to that story, because Galileo was kind of a jerk and tried to force people's hands and stuff like that. And not everybody in the Church was for censuring Galileo. As a matter of fact, Blaise Pascal later said it was a really bad idea. But by that time, Aristotle had caught on. Why? Well, when Aristotle first came out, when Aristotle first arrived in the Latin West, he was felt to be presenting a real challenge to church doctrine. Aristotle taught things like when the body dies, the soul does not survive. Or the world has been here from eternity. Now, if you know much about Jewish or Christian or Muslim theology, you realize those are big problems, right? If you want to make that person your central thinker, you got a problem, because all those religions teach that the soul survives after the death of the body, and they all teach that the world began at a certain point in time. So you've got a couple different options there, right? Think about it this way. You've got two friends. Your friends don't get along. What can you do?
Hang out with them separately?
Yeah, you can do what we call compartmentalization. So you could say, well, when it comes to physics, we'll read Aristotle. When it comes to things about, ethics, we'll use the church doctrine. So you could compartmentalize. That's often not very satisfying. And then what happens when one of your friends sees you, in another place, and they catch on that you've been leading this kind of double life? I had a friend. I'll tell you this very quick story about a very imprudent friend of mine. Long dead, unfortunately. He was my best friend. And he was a nice guy, really loyal, but one of his character flaws was he always had to have 2 or 3 girlfriends. And, that could be workable if they knew about each other and they were okay with it and that sort of thing. But do you think that's what he did? No, what he would do is he would first start dating one girl, and things would be going great with her, and I think she's the one and all that. And then inexplicably, he'd have another girl that he'd meet over here, and she's a lot of fun too. He'd start going out with both of them, and he'd try to keep them completely separate from each other. So now he's living 2 different love lives. And then he'd add a third one. And what do you have to do in cases like that in order to keep it going? You have to tell lies, right? And the problem with this guy, if you're really, really smart, I guess you could probably get away with telling lies. But unless you can keep track of all those lies, sooner or later, people are going to start seeing through them. And these girls would always start seeing through it, and so the whole house of cards would come tumbling down. And the first couple times we were like, we were good friends. We were trying to, we'd be like, oh, this is bad. Don't you see the error of your ways? You shouldn't do this sort of thing. And then after a while, we realized this is just the way he was, and he was going to keep doing this, and we would just watch because it was kind of entertaining. Now, can you do that with faith and reason? If you have a religious faith, that's really core to your identity, to how you think about things. If it's not just going to church on Sunday, and then doing whatever the hell you want to do the rest of the week, but it's actually part of who you are, it's part of the way you approach things, that's pretty deeply rooted. The reason, on the other hand, that's also very deeply rooted. That's part of your very nature as a human being. That's what separates you from the animals. So if you're going to separate faith and reason out like two friends who can't get along, you're probably going to be living two different lives. But they will catch you. Did you have your hand up, Mr. Beerholz, before? Okay. So what else can you do with two friends who can't get along? Yeah.
If you could just hang out with them together, and if they're going to be immature about it, you could just drop the one that's being immature.
You can take sides. You can kick one out in favor of the other. Yeah, that's a possibility. One second. And that's what some people did in the Middle Ages. They would side purely for reason or purely for faith. Yeah. Mediate between them. You can try to reconcile them in some way to get them to see that the other person may have something valid on their side. That's what Thomas opted for. So the question is whether it's going to be faith versus reason, and you just compartmentalize, or maybe you side with one against the other, or you somehow try to reconcile them. And it's not always easy to reconcile them. There's some things about the nature of human reason and revealed faith that make that synthesis difficult, but not necessarily impossible. Somebody like Thomas is a good example. Some people have actually thought you can't reconcile them. So, there are people that we call rationalists. Nowadays we often call them secularists, and they believe that, look, faith is totally irrational, and if we're going to have an ethics or we're going to have any sort of coherent philosophy, it's got to be purely rational. You have to get rid of anything religious then. Any religious commitments are going to be an impediment to thinking things through right. That's one viewpoint you can take. That's not a viewpoint Thomas takes. That's what we call rationalism, or again, in contemporary terms, we call it secularism. Another way you can go is you side with faith and you say reason is no good. And this has been around for a long time. There are a lot of famous people who have taken this position. Martin Luther, for example, really interesting author. I like reading Luther in part because he says such wild things. He says reason is a whore. Well, you wouldn't really trust a prostitute to give you true testimony, would you? That's the sort of stuff Luther would commonly say. He was very earthy, we nowadays say about that sort of language. I won't say some of the other stuff he said because it's actually going on a video, and you have to engage in a lot of profanity to do so. But why was he doing that? Well, he thought that faith was so important that if you mix in purely human reason, you're gonna screw it up. Peter Damian, during the Middle Ages, not that far removed from Thomas Aquinas, great example of somebody who said faith is it, and even studying grammar is bad. Not studying philosophy, just studying grammar. Grammar is the tool of the devil. And we have people like this today, right? Oftentimes we call them fundamentalists, although that's an inexact term. The actual fundamentalists are actually a pretty small group. We use the term very loosely. Another term you can use is fideists, those who privilege faith over reason. Thomas doesn't go that way either. Thomas is trying to bring about a synthesis of the two. And he thinks that faith and reason, if they're actually being understood right, if they're actually being used right, so not just the faith of somebody who's a hypocrite, say, but genuine faith, and not just the reason of somebody who uses reason in kind of a self-serving way or doesn't follow things out, but the reason of the person who really, thinks things through, they're ultimately going to come to the same conclusions. So what that means is that for nearly anything that the faith is teaching, if you look hard enough, you could find some rational justification for it. So for instance, we're not going to talk about this in this class, we talk about this in Intro to Philosophy. If you're a Christian or Jew or Muslim, do you believe God exists or not? Yes. I mean, you can't be a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim and say, well, I don't know there's any God. I don't believe there is a God. Then you'd be something different, right? Whether God exists or not, is this something you can solve by just looking outside? Can you do a litmus test for it? Get the Godometer out, there he is. You can't do that. You have to do it by argument. And the faith, whether it's Judaism or Christianity or Islam, one of these, great monotheistic religions, is teaching that God exists. It's not necessarily providing an argument the way that philosophy would do. And so in your intro to philosophy class, you probably looked at some arguments for God's existence, right? The ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument. I don't know how they taught it here, but that's usually how we go through it. Well, that would be a case where something that the thinker learned originally from faith, they tried to reason out with philosophy. You can do the same thing in ethics. Let's take the Ten Commandments. What do the Ten Commandments tell you that you should or shouldn't do? Should you commit adultery? It's against that, right? And it doesn't just, does that mean that if you're not married, hey, do anything you want? Is that the way the Ten Commandments actually work? I'm not covered under that case because I'm not married. I'm divorced now, actually, so, does that mean I'm free myself to do whatever I want? If I'm following that? No, it's understood a little bit more broadly, right? You're not supposed to be having sexual relations outside of the defined sphere of marriage. That's usually how it's understood. So you can get that principle from faith, right? Do you have to be a philosopher to know that you shouldn't cheat on your spouse? I hope not. How many of you are majoring in philosophy? None of you? Because I know this because we asked before. So that means you're going to cheat on your spouse, right? Because you're not a philosophy major, you're not doing this full time. No, you could know that you're not supposed to do that because maybe, you see all these signs that people put in their yards with the Ten Commandments. You see that thou shalt not commit adultery. You say, that applies to me as well as other people, right? But you could also reason. Let's say you didn't have you didn't have the Ten Commandments. Not everybody did. Could you reach the notion that you shouldn't cheat on your spouse by thinking it out? You could. That's one of the great things about human beings. We don't just have to be told in an authoritative way how to behave. We can actually reason it out for ourselves. Is there anything that would maybe lead you astray so that you wouldn't reach that conclusion? Sure. Remember we talked about this with Aristotle. Your emotions, your passions can lead you astray. You can say, well, that spouse next door looks really good. I know I shouldn't, but maybe I should too. So your reasoning doesn't always go right. But if your reasoning is going right, you should be able to figure out the way that you ought to behave, right? What were you going to say?
I was going to say, if you're an egoist, then you really might not care what your wife thinks or the other spouse thinks, so you probably go straight that way.
Yeah, and you notice the different moral theories that we've studied. So let's take egoism as an example. Actually, let's use egoism and contractarianism as two examples. They both articulate ways in which we reason about things. And the egoist is self-centered. And everything is judged in accordance with their interests or their desires. So if the egoist is going to say, well, I'm not going to cheat on my spouse, why wouldn't they? I mean, it's a lot of pleasure to cheat on your spouse. That's why people do it. There's really two main reasons. There's other reasons too, but there's two main reasons people cheat on their spouses. What would they be?
Probably getting tired of them.
Yeah, and so you want to get pleasure. People do get tired of each other in relationships. You don't have to be married either to have that happen, right? So there's the lure of pleasure. And what's the one other big reason why people cheat on their spouses?
Revenge.
Exactly. Anger. Just show them. And these could be connected. Like maybe your spouse isn't paying enough attention to you because they're tired of you. Well, I'm going to show them. you know. An egoist, those are desires, those are passions. An egoist might say, well, you know, my spouse no longer satisfies me the way that they did when we first married. I would like to be satisfied. This person next door looks awfully good. I should go sleep with them. And what would hold an egoist back? Well, maybe a reasoning like this. If I cheat with this person next door, their spouse is going to get angry and shoot at me. I don't want to get shot at, therefore I won't cheat with them. But then that just tells you, find somebody else to cheat with. It doesn't tell you cheating is wrong, right? It doesn't tell you you shouldn't cheat at all. A contractarian would look at it a little bit differently. Remember, contractarians are about agreements and keeping social order. And what would happen if, let's pretend we're all married people now, right? And each one of you has a spouse. What would happen if one of us starts cheating on, you know, with somebody else's spouse? That's kind of breaking the social contract, because the social contract would say, I keep my hands off of your stuff, you keep your hands off of my stuff, and then everything goes nice, right? What are you going to say, Mr. Fairmont?
Would an egoist not, could an egoist find a reason not to cheat on their wife, like also because, like, then she might do it to him in return?
Yeah, the egoist can find reasons not to do things that most people consider bad, like, say, cheating on spouses. But the egoist's reasoning for that will just be because that would negatively affect me. And that could be a good reason. I shouldn't cheat on my spouse because I don't want them to, out of revenge, cheat on me, because that would go against my desires. So yeah, an egoist can arrive at those conclusions. Notice the difference. The egoist never says, this is just the wrong thing to do. That's not available from that perspective. The contractarian can say that's the wrong thing to do because it violates the social contract. Somebody like Thomas Aquinas could say it for a couple reasons. It's wrong because God says not to do it. You know, God doesn't like you cheating on your spouses. Could be wrong because it goes against something having to do with reason. You know, and we're going to talk more about that later on. This is leading us towards these two different types of ethics. There's one called the divine command theory. Thomas is not an example of the divine command theory. The divine command theory of morality says, God says do this, therefore this is the right thing to do. God says don't do this, therefore this is the wrong thing to do. And there's a lot of people who run their lives and make their moral decisions based on that sort of idea, right? And if that's the case, the key thing is to figure out what God actually wants. And it could be God, or it could be the gods, it could be anything you like. It could be, you know, what the great potato chip in the sky says is important, you know. What matters is that there's some sort of supreme being, some greater being, and that being tells you what to do, and what's right or wrong is what's in accordance with that. Yeah?
I feel like, though, like, when they, in the church, if they tell you something just straightforward, it is what it is. You can't really rationalize yourself the wrong way. I think when you're trying to rationalize yourself with reason,
Yeah.
that is a thin line with, you know, going towards the right way and the wrong way, because you can always rationalize doing something bad.
Yes.
You know, because there's always something good from it.
Yeah.
You know, like, stuff, like, you'd be going the wrong way completely.
That's a good point. Now, somebody like Thomas would say that you could step back and look at your reasoning process. I mean, you can distinguish wrongly using reason just to rationalize satisfying your desires, which is what you're talking about, right? Where your desire leads, and then reason is not actually telling you what to do. Reason is just being used as a tool to satisfy what you want. And then a right use of reason, where you're using reason to regulate the desires. Like, if you catch yourself actually rationalizing, one of the things you can do is you can say, what the hell am I doing? You know, I'm I've come to the conclusion that it's okay, we'll use the cheating again. It's okay to cheat on my spouse. There must be something wrong with this. And then you can start looking at yourself and saying, aha, I've got a strong desire to cheat on my spouse. Or just have sex in general, right? Because we have strong desires that way. I shouldn't be using reason this way. You can step back and actually do that. So not every case of using reason is just egoistic rationalizing. We can use reason to figure out what we ought to do. But what you started off with saying was that the church or some other moral authority can provide hard and fast guidelines, right? And that maybe it's better to rely on those than to rely on reason, because reason can lead us astray. One of the interesting things that Thomas points out, and you see this in a lot of churches, is this notion that what is our nature? What did God make us like? And here we start getting into, theology, the anthropology of the person. He made us rational beings. So using reason would be something that God would actually want from us. Now, not everybody teaches this. There are some churches that teach turn reason off, just faith, not reason. But at least the church that Thomas is working in, at least some of the time with some of its practitioners, thinks that reason is a good thing, and you want to try to prune away the bad parts of it. Because human reason is damaged, but it's not completely unreliable. So two questions. Perhaps Mr.
I just think, like, people in churches are flawed, like popes, bishops, everyone.
Well, everybody's flawed.
I mean, like,
According to this viewpoint, according to the church's viewpoint, everybody's flawed, except for one guy,
everything is like based off of assumptions that one cannot like one assumes there is a God and that he even gives a damn.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things you need in order to get religion off the ground. So it's sort of, it'd be sort of like saying to a soccer club, you have to prove that soccer exists before you have your club. It'd be a little bit cart before the horse. I mean, there's all sorts of criticisms you could make of organized religion. That's probably not the one that's going to hold much water
I know that,
with people.
I'm just...
Well, then we're going to move on, because we have limited class time. And I'm not bringing this up to have a big debate about the value of organized religion. I'm giving you context for what Thomas is doing. So divine command theory.
I was just going to say, having faith without reason is kind of like just telling somebody, oh, you shouldn't do this. Like, we say, oh,
or you should.
To your child,
Yeah.
oh, you shouldn't go out past 9. They're going to just say, oh, well, why not?
Yeah.
And then they're going to just do that without reason, if they don't use their reasoning skills.
You mean they're going to follow what you want them to follow?
They may not follow what you want because they don't have the reasoning okay,
Yeah.
why am I doing this? Or if you want someone to do something and they don't understand why they're doing it, they might not be able to do it that specific way.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to get too far into this, but with kids, you can't reason with them on every point. That's why we eventually resort to shut up and do it, But you're right, if we want adults who can actually use reason, they have to have some practice in relying on reason and not just blindly obeying some authority. Because, these are habits. If your habit is to blindly obey some authority and never think about whether the authority is the right authority, it's very hard to break that habit. Oftentimes, people do when they leave a religious group that relies on blind authority, they find some other thing that's just as authoritative. Like they leave the church and they become a hardcore atheist, and they're almost like a fundamentalist of atheism, or they go the other way. Now, what I want to get to, so we have the divine command theory. Things are right just because God says they're right. Things are wrong because God says they're wrong. It's only God's sort of fiat or will that makes it so. So with the divine command theory, one of the problems with this, what if God tomorrow said, thou shalt commit adultery? Then it would be good. There are some religious groups that hold that polygamy is a sacred duty. They claim that God is telling them that this is the case. They rely on the divine command theory. It becomes very difficult. If your divine command theory and your understanding of what God is saying, it says you shouldn't commit adultery, but theirs says, well, actually, we've got this book and it says in here that God told us we should have multiple wives, at least. Most of these. Usually when you find this, it's not wives having multiple husbands. It's almost always husbands having multiple wives, which should lead you to be a little bit, suspicious of what's going on with some of these, right? But how could you reconcile those? It seems like the divine command theory, one of the problems with it is there's an awful lot of religious groups, aren't there? And they don't all teach the same thing on every point, do they? Well, one of the other possibilities for an ethics that has some sort of religious connection is what we call natural law theory. And this is what Thomas actually proposes, which is that you know some things by faith, and then you try to see whether you can use reason to actually get to those same points. And if it turns out that you can, you know why that's the case? Because God has placed within human beings a natural law. So if you didn't know that it's not okay to kill indiscriminately, to go around and just mow down human beings, you could actually think that through and figure that out on your own, I think. I hope so. Right? If you didn't have the Ten Commandments, does that mean that, if the Ten Commandments are around, thou shalt not murder, isn't in there, everyone's going to be killing each other? No, because we have certain inclinations, Thomas says, and if we think those out, we realize that reason tells us there's a certain right way to live. Now, where did that reason come from? Well, ultimately from, if we're created beings, ultimately from God. But do you have to have God in there in the picture actively saying, thou shalt, in order to get this off the ground? You don't. So is this something that maybe let's say you're a believer in one of the great, three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Let's say your best friend is an atheist. Could you guys both reason together about whether you should steal, whether you should lie, whether you should kill? You could, couldn't you? Maybe what you would be doing then, according to Thomas, is discovering the natural law that you believe is implanted in you by God, and the atheist just thinks, well, that's just the way we happen to think. And you don't actually need the atheist to say, God placed that law there or anything like that. So long as they can recognize it and live by it, they're not going to kill you or steal from you or cheat, on your spouse or lie. That would be pretty good, wouldn't it? So natural law theory has a religious basis, but it's not a religious ethic in the same way that the divine command theory is. The divine command theory, if you don't belong to somebody else's religious group, you're not going to find very convincing their statements about what God has told them they have to do, and you have to do as well. How many of you fast during Ramadan? Nobody? Nobody fasts out of sort of solidarity with their Muslim brethren? How many of you, what would be a good Christian example? There's mostly Christian culture, so most of you are probably in that. How many of you celebrate Hindu holidays? None? Why not? Well, because you don't believe that those are divinely commanded, right? If you actually did believe that you had to fast during one whole month of the year the way the Muslims do, because God told you, then you would be believing in the divine command theory, wouldn't you? The divine command theory as interpreted by this group. Perhaps you actually, can recognize some of what you do as, if you're a religious believer, as like the divine command theory or like the natural law theory. We're going to explore the natural law theory. We would explore the divine command theory, but we don't have enough time in this semester. So, all of that said, Let's look at the actual reading and question for today. Thomas Aquinas is approaching the question of happiness. Who else raised this as a central question at the start? Yeah. Plato did, but somebody that we studied just recently, Aristotle. And this is why Thomas is raising this. He thinks that, just like remember Aristotle said, well, you got to get the big picture before you can go to work on the details. You got to figure out what you're really striving after and what it looks like, for your whole life, not just focus on individual actions. Thomas is doing the same thing. And he wants to know what is the greatest, most satisfying good. And, people have different views on this, don't they? Ask the crack addict what the most satisfying good is, and what do they think it is? Smoking crack. That came to mind because I was watching the Dave Chappelle show last night. I'm glad he's back on the air because I like his comedy. Ask somebody who cheats on their spouse all the time, and that seems to be the main center of their life. What's the good life? Having sex with as many people as possible. Physical pleasure, right? Physical pleasure of a different sort. Ask somebody who sacrifices for their kids and works 2-3 jobs. What's the most important thing in life? They may say their kids, right? What will make them happy? Seeing their kids prosper. Thomas considers 8 different sets of questions in this. Could happiness be this? Could happiness be this? Could happiness be this? And you notice he doesn't, in his format, I'll talk more about his format next class, he doesn't come right out and say, here's what I think. He considers other people's points of view. This is an important thing. If you want to actually have your own point of view be good, you have to actually show that you can consider everybody else's point of view. How many of you are business majors again? So when you go in and you give a report, you're going to have somebody else giving a report alongside you, and you've got to be able to say why your report is better. And you can't do that unless you understand their report. If you're proposing a solution to a problem for your company, your boss wants to know that you can actually tell them why this is, or her, why this is a better option. That's what Thomas is about here. So what does he start with? He starts with one of the same things that we saw before, wealth. What's wrong with wealth? How many of you don't want money? You don't want money?
It's not that I don't want it, but it's not that important if I have it or not.
Yeah, I mean, some people actually live lives of poverty deliberately, religious orders, some hippie types. You're not proposing something like that. You're proposing living with modest means, right?
I'm proposing that one needs it to survive, but one shouldn't wrap themselves too much into, oh my God, more and more and more.
Yeah. One
should know when enough's enough.
And Thomas introduces an interesting distinction here. He talks about natural and artificial wealth. Natural wealth is like, your clothes, food, drink, the things that satisfy your basic needs, shelter, transportation. Notice he includes transportation in there, along with all these other things. He's not part of a sedentary society. The Middle Ages were not as dark as people often think they were. What is artificial wealth? Money, or things that count for money. So your bank accounts, what's good about your bank accounts, you can spend that to get this stuff. Can you buy, as this proverbial song goes, can money buy you love? They can buy you people hanging out with you and saying they love you. Maybe the gifts, if you really buy the right gifts, you can, get the person to start loving you. Thoughtful gifts, not just, expensive gifts. What else can't money buy? There's a lot of goods money can't actually buy. What about goods of the body? I mean, I have to go to the doctor pretty soon for my first, whatever you call it, physical with a GP, a family doctor, because I moved up here and all that. He's gonna want money, isn't he? And if he says, you need to take this drug or that drug, if I go to the pharmacy, and I say, well, the doctor says I need to have this drug. Can I have it, please? What are they going to say? You got to pay for it. So there are some goods of the body that it can pay for. Can spending money get me in shape?
Yeah.
Well, yes and no. Okay, how can spending money get me in shape? You can hire a trainer. You can just like not listen to your trainer and sit on the couch. Just spending the money by itself is not going to get you in shape. You have to exercise, don't you? This is the part where most people get kind of, they buy gym memberships for 6 months and they don't go to the gym. Money can't even do that. That's a good of the body. So money, like you pointed out, yeah, money is not the thing that's going to be happiness. Being rich is not necessarily being happy. As a matter of fact, they do these happiness studies, and they find out that at least in Western countries, rich people aren't really that happy. They're marginally happier than poor people. It is better, as far as happiness goes, to have more wealth than to have less, but it's not enough. So what are the next contentions? He talks about other external goods, and he talks about honor and fame or glory, and he talks about power. And notice he talks about all of these as being external goods. Now, money, okay, it's easy to see why that's external, right? Or property. I can take this sweater off, put another sweater on. I could, swap sweaters with, or not sweaters, but you have a sweatshirt with Mr. Bryant, right? We can exchange our things. Probably couldn't exchange shoes because I have massive feet, almost clown shoe sized ones. Honor. Honor is a little bit different. Honor is pertaining to the person. Remember we talked about this before? And notice Thomas is distinguishing honor and fame or glory or reputation. And all of you want to be honored to some degree. You want people to respect you. Why do people respect you, though? Is that automatic? Do they just do that? What do people respect you for?
Accomplishments.
Oh, accomplishments? That's one thing. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say your actions.
Ah, yeah. So accomplishments are what happen from your actions. Your actions. What do your actions display about you?
Like your character and like your virtues.
Exactly. So we're honored for good things about us. That means that honor itself can't be the final good. Because if it's for the sake of something else, if it's derived from something else, maybe having virtues will be the final good then. Maybe that's what happiness is. Well, but it can't be honor. Did you?
I was just gonna say like the way you carry yourself.
Yeah. Although that's going to, I think, have more to do with glory or fame. This is more like just reputation. People looking at you and saying, that person's important, that person's good. Why isn't that going to work? Well, let's see what Thomas actually says in that case. He says, glory consists in being well known and praised. Now, the thing known is related to human knowledge, otherwise than to God's knowledge. Human knowledge of somebody else's states, is kind of imperfect, isn't it? Do you really know, like in their heart of hearts, the people that you deal with, whether they have good character or not? You know some general signs, but you can be mistaken, can't you? And you can always ask, why do we make people famous? What do we make people famous for in our society? Who are the big famous people? Entertainers, right? So comedians, musicians, actors. Am I leaving anything out? Athletes. I guess you could call athletes in a certain sense entertainers. Although they'd be almost more, they'd be like dancers, where it's extremely demanding physically. So those are some people that we make into celebrities, right? Who else are celebrities? Some politicians become celebrities, right? Some people actually get into politics, and then it turns out that it's actually more lucrative for them to not be in charge, to not have power, and just to have fame. Like Mike Huckabee, he ran for president. He's got his own TV show now. He's not running for president anymore. He's got a very successful TV show where he talks about people running for president. And he's spared the trouble of having to do it. Well, all of these things are valuing somebody for something else. We have some celebrities who became celebrities just by having a lot of Facebook friends. Like Tila Tequila, that's how she made her bones. She had a huge amount of friends. It may not have been on Facebook, it might have been in MySpace or something like that. We have other people who are famous for being famous, like Paris Hilton. Well, that's pretty empty, isn't it? That's not actually happiness. That's an external good. What about power? Having power over people. Now we're kind of talking, aren't we? Getting to make people do what you want. I mean, if you have power, you can handle all these other things, can't you? This is part of why the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement have so many adherents and are so angry. They're actually angry at a lot of the same things, having to do with other people who have power and use that power to get all this stuff at everybody else's expense, whether you're part of the 99% or the 53% or whatever you want to say. You're not one of the powerful, are you? Wouldn't it be nice to have power? Be able to tell people what to do? Think about how easy your life would be if you were king for a day, queen for a day, or king for life. Yeah.
I'm just going to say, just because you have power doesn't mean you're going to be happy, because if you use your power to get the negative results that you didn't want, accidentally, let's say.
Yeah, we have movies like that, don't we? Where somebody gets power, and what do? They screw things up. Like Bruce Almighty. That's the whole premise of that movie, Bruce Almighty. Another movie that's sort of like that is Click. You guys ever seen that movie where he's got the remote and he can fast forward, and he fast forwards through most of his life. He wants to get through boring conversations with his wife, and then he ends up being a stranger. Power is not by itself good or bad. It can be used for good ends or it can be used for bad ends. So that means it can't be the good. It can't be happiness. So these are all external goods. What's more yours? What belongs to you? If we strip away your wealth, we strip away your reputation, we strip away your power, what do you still have left over?
How do you feel?
Yeah, that's actually, you're sort of skipping ahead to what Thomas calls the soul. What else do you have? Yeah.
The sense of self.
Yeah, it's also part of your soul. Give you a hint. It's what's sitting in the chair right now. Those of you who are athletes, this is what you work out. You're not working out your soul. You work out your body, right? And there's goods of the body, right? What are some of the things that make a body good? Being alive, as opposed to being dead. That's a big one. Preservation of life. But that's not the only thing. What else is good about a body? could be good about a body? Good looks, right? Being attractive. If you look in the mirror and you're happy with what you see in the mirror, that's a component of happiness, isn't it? If you look in the mirror and you think that you don't look good, you're probably going to be less happy or unhappy, aren't you? There are some people who, even if there's all sorts of disorders, what we call body dysmorphism. Are you guys familiar with this term at all? What's body dysmorphism?
Like, someone thinks something about their body, like in an exaggerated way, like
Yeah.
their nose is too big, or,
It could be facial features. Very often it has to do with the whole frame. Like, women tend to get it in terms of fatness and thinness. So women who are, constantly losing weight because they're anorexic, look in the mirror and they actually see somebody who's fat. They're seeing a hallucination. Bless you. Men tend to get it in terms of bulking up. So there are these guys who are just gigantic, and they look in the mirror, and they don't actually see a guy who's almost totally, Hulk-like muscle-bound. They see a guy who's got thin arms. So, appearance is a good of the body. We do spend a lot of attention on appearance, don't we? Not just sight, smell, touch. People's skin should be smooth, exfoliate. Or whatever, I don't know. I don't do skin stuff, so maybe some of you can tell me more about that. What else is good for the body? What about health? Like Aristotle says, when somebody's sick, I'm going through this right now myself, happiness consists in not being sick and getting better. You almost forget what it's like to not be sick. Now, could the goods of the body be truly satisfying? He also talks about one other one. I should pleasure, right? And pleasure, you have pleasures of different sorts. You have all sorts of bodily pleasures. You like eating, right? You like some food. That's bodily. That's your senses taking it in. You like listening to music, right? How do you take in music? Through your ears. Do any of you, have like scented candles or wear cologne or perfume or things like that? Do you just put on any old cologne? Reach for the first thing you see in the store? No? You like certain things, don't you? They bring you pleasure. Could goods of the body be the be-all and end-all of happiness? Well, let's see again what Thomas actually says. Why not? Well, there's two problems. One is, are you just your body? If you're a materialist, then you probably think yes. If you believe that you have a soul, then how could a good of the body be the be-all and end-all when you've also got this thing called the soul? Think about people who work out all the time, and they don't appear to be particularly happy as a result. They're in prime physical health, but they're not happy because they've neglected the soul. Or they have plastic surgery all the time. And they look really great. What about pleasure? This is one we've had before, right? All of you like pleasure, I hope. None of you are ahedonic, meaning you don't enjoy pleasant things. That would be terrible. Because pleasure does feel really good. Different kinds of pleasure. Why can't pleasure be the good? Well, Thomas tells you why. And this is where it gets really interesting. This has to do with his understanding of human nature. He says, first, two things. We experience a lot of different kinds of pleasure or delight. And which do most people know best? Do they know pleasures of the soul or intellect more, or do they know pleasures of the body more? What do you think? In our society. Body, yeah. We can all relate to that. Is there anybody here who doesn't like eating food? Or, you know, there's no food that you like, that you crave sometimes? Anybody here who doesn't like listening to music? Anybody here who doesn't enjoy, you know, going out on a nice day, being outside? Yeah.
It all depends on the times.
Times, okay, yeah, but you then.
If I know I'm not hungry, I'm not gonna seek satisfaction.
Oh, sure. Right. I'm not asking about very specific cases. I'm just asking in general. Do you enjoy food? And the reason I'm asking this is to make a point about physical delights. We can all relate to these. Are there pleasures that are not bodily? How many of you have enjoyed reading a book? That was not a bodily pleasure. According to Thomas or Aristotle and people like that, that's something that you enjoy because you have a soul, you have an intellect, you have a mind. How many of you have enjoyed just being with a friend or a family member? Again, that's not just a pleasure of the body, that's a pleasure, that's a delight of the soul or the mind. That's of a higher order. We're going to talk more about this when we get to John Stuart Mill later in the semester. So what he says, okay, so a lot of things are pleasures of the body, and then he talks about this stuff about essences and proper accidents, and that's a lot of metaphysics that's going to be hard to understand, so I'm going to skip over that. But what he says is every delight is something that results from happiness, or from some part of happiness. The reason a man is delighted is he has some fitting good, some good that's appropriate to him. So, Mr. Schwartz, what's your favorite food?
Chicken?
Any kind of chicken?
Yeah.
Really? Wow, you're easy to please. Ms. Fryer, what's your favorite kind of food?
The king crab.
What's that?
King crab.
King? Well, that's good too, yeah. Okay. What Thomas is calling a fitting good is going to vary from person to person depending on, say, their taste. So for Ms. Fryer, king crab is at the top of the rank. For Mr. Schwartz, it's something different. It's another kind of meat, both like meat, but it might be chocolate for somebody else in here. Is there anybody in here who chocolate's their favorite thing? That would be another fitting good. There are all sorts of goods that are appropriate to us. And notice you can say they are generic. They're both kinds of food. They both have favorite foods, right? But they're different. So when you have your fitting good, that makes you happy. So, you know, like he says, it's when you either have it in reality or hope or memory. So think about the last time you had king crab.
Last Christmas.
Yeah. And now think about that taste and that memory. And you actually start to feel a little bit better. There's actually sort of a trick you can pull on yourself. If you're not feeling good, think about happy thoughts. Why does that actually work for us? Because we experience that delight. Now, if I tell you, this isn't true, but let's say I were to say, if you get an A in this class, I'm going to buy you king crab. Now you're hoping for king crab, right? But I'm not buying anybody king crab. I'm on an adjunct salary, so even less than what I made as a professor. But that's an appropriate good, and thinking about that, thinking about the enjoyment of that, you feel pleasure in some way. It's those goods that give you the pleasure, though, isn't it? The pleasure itself is not happiness. Those goods are productive of that. So that can't be what happiness is. What about goods of the soul themselves, like states of character? This is where, Aristotle would have said, yeah, that's it. Thomas is going beyond him. And Thomas says, the soul is not the end of human beings. We're ordered to something higher than just the human soul. For Aristotle, perfecting the human soul, bringing out the virtues, that was it. That was the best thing you could have. Doing that with friends, actually. We've got to remember, virtuous activity with sufficient means and with friends to share it with. That was it for Aristotle. Thomas is looking beyond, of course, because he's in this Christian tradition, and so are Jewish Aristotelians and Muslim Aristotelians. And he's saying, if we think about the human being's last end, soul is not that. You enjoy happiness through your soul, but just perfecting your soul is not the be-all and end-all of everything. So what could be? And then at the very end, he asks, can any created good be happiness? We've actually run through all the different categories of created goods. What do we mean by created goods? Goods that aren't God. There would only be one thing that's not created in this framework, right? And I'm not saying you have to buy into this. I want to make that very clear. What we're doing here is trying to understand Thomas's position, not trying to endorse Thomas's position. But if you buy into this framework, then there's created goods, everything that we see here, everything that we experience, and then there's one uncreated good. What is that? That's God. What do our wills, what do our deepest desires actually aim at? Thomas is going to say the only object that could be truly satisfying, that isn't just part of happiness, that is happiness itself, is God. That's kind of a weird thing to say, isn't it? I mean, even for a lot of religious believers want to get in good with God because God will give them nice stuff. Or God will make them happy, right? But is God itself, himself, three-self, if you're a Trinitarian Christian, I guess, happiness itself? That's where I'm going to leave you, because this is a thought that you have to think about a bit for it to make some sense. But this is where Thomas is going. He thinks that our last end, our ultimate goal, is relationship with God, and that all these other things are sort of facsimiles along the way.